My uncle showed Dad a fake DNA test saying I wasn't his daughter. Dad kicked me out and cut me from his will. The real test showed 99.9% I was his daughter. But Dad had already died without knowing the truth. Growing up in Louisiana, I always thought our family was pretty normal despite the drama that seemed to follow us everywhere. Dad owned a small auto repair shop that had been in our family for 3 generations, and I'd been working there since I was 16, getting my hands dirty and learning everything about engines. Mom had passed when I was 12, and it had always been just me and Dad against the world. Well, and my uncle, Dad's older brother, who lived about 20 minutes down the road. My uncle had always been the kind of person who made comments that left you feeling uncomfortable but not quite sure why. He'd make these little remarks about how I didn't look much like Dad, or how I had Mom's stubborn streak that must have come from somewhere else entirely. I brushed it off as typical family teasing, the kind that happens when people have known each other their whole lives and run out of new things to say. Dad and I had our ups and downs like any father and daughter, but we were close. Really close. He taught me everything about fixing cars, about running a business, about being independent. When other girls my age were getting manicures, I was rebuilding transmissions. When they were worried about prom dresses, I was figuring out why Mrs. Henderson's old Buick kept stalling at red lights. Dad was proud of me in a way that made me feel like I could conquer the world. The shop was doing well enough that we weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. Dad had been talking about retirement lately, about how the business would be mine someday, about how proud he was that I'd chosen to stay and carry on the family tradition instead of running off to college like so many kids did. Those conversations always made me feel warm inside, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My uncle's visits became more frequent as Dad started talking about retirement. He'd show up at the shop during lunch breaks or stop by the house on Sunday afternoons when we were watching football. The conversations always seemed to drift toward family history, toward stories about Dad's wild younger days, toward questions about Mom that made Dad's face get that distant look it always got when he missed her. I started noticing that my uncle would bring up genetic traits a lot. He'd point out customers who looked just like their parents, or comment on how strong family resemblances could be. Then he'd look at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and say something about how genetics could be funny sometimes, how you never really knew what you were going to get. The whole thing came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was under the hood of a pickup truck, trying to figure out why it was making this weird grinding noise when I heard raised voices coming from Dad's office. My uncle was there, and they were arguing about something in hushed, angry tones that carried through the thin walls. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard my name several times and something about papers and something about the truth. My stomach started churning in that way it does when you know something bad is about to happen but you don't know what it is yet. When my uncle left, he walked past me without saying goodbye, which was unusual. He always made a point of saying goodbye, usually with some comment about how I was getting grease under my fingernails again or how I should think about finding a nice boy to settle down with. Dad stayed in his office for the rest of the afternoon, and when I tried to ask him about lunch, he just waved me off and said he wasn't hungry. That evening at home, Dad was quiet during dinner. Not his usual comfortable quiet where he was just tired from a long day, but the kind of quiet that feels heavy and makes you afraid to break it. I tried making conversation about the truck I'd been working on, about the new parts order that had come in, about anything that might get him talking, but he just nodded and pushed his food around his plate. After dinner, he asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. He had this manila envelope in his hands, and his face looked older than I'd ever seen it. He told me that my uncle had brought him something that afternoon, something that was going to change everything between us. He pulled out what looked like official papers from some laboratory, with lots of technical language and numbers that didn't mean anything to me. But at the bottom, in bold letters, it said that the probability of paternity was 0%. The man listed as the potential father had been excluded as the biological father of the child in question. I stared at those papers for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The man listed as the potential father was my dad. The child in question was me. Dad's voice was shaking when he told me that my uncle had been suspicious for years, that he'd finally convinced Dad to get a DNA test done without telling me. He said the results proved what my uncle had been saying all along, that I wasn't his biological daughter, that Mom must have had an affair, that everything he believed about our family was a lie. I tried to argue, tried to explain that this had to be some kind of mistake, that there was no way Mom would have done something like that. But Dad had already made up his mind. He said he'd been thinking about all the times my uncle had pointed out how I didn't look like him, how my personality was so different from his, how I had talents and interests that didn't seem to run in our family. The next few days were a blur of packing my things and trying to figure out where I was going to live. Dad had made it clear that I wasn't welcome in the house anymore, that the shop wasn't mine to inherit, that he needed time to process what he'd learned. He wasn't cruel about it, but he was distant in a way that broke my heart into a million pieces. I ended up moving in with a friend from high school who had a spare room in her apartment across town. She didn't ask too many questions, just helped me carry my boxes and made sure I had somewhere to sleep. I tried calling Dad a few times, but he never picked up. I tried stopping by the shop, but he'd hired someone to replace me and made it clear that my presence made him uncomfortable. My uncle, meanwhile, was suddenly everywhere. He'd show up at the grocery store when I was shopping or at the diner where I'd started picking up shifts as a waitress to pay rent. He was always sympathetic, always ready with a sad shake of his head and some comment about how difficult this must be for everyone involved. He'd tell me he was sorry things had worked out this way, but that the truth was the truth and there was nothing anyone could do about it now. The worst part was watching him step into the role at the shop that should have been mine. Dad needed help with the administrative side of things as he got older, and my uncle was right there to offer his assistance. He started spending more time there, started making decisions about ordering and scheduling, started talking about the future of the business like it was his to plan. I felt like I was watching my entire life get stolen from me piece by piece. The shop where I'd learned everything I knew about cars and about myself. The relationship with my dad that had been the foundation of everything I believed about family and love and belonging. The future I'd been working toward since I was 16 years old. All of it was just gone, erased by a few pieces of paper that said I wasn't who I thought I was. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I was working double shifts at the diner just to make ends meet, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of my friend's spare room, trying to figure out how to rebuild my entire identity from scratch. I'd grown up knowing exactly who I was and where I belonged, and suddenly I was nobody with no family and no future and no idea how to move forward. I tried dating, thinking maybe it would help me figure out who I was outside of being my dad's daughter. But every relationship felt hollow because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying about my own history. How do you explain to someone that you just found out your entire childhood was built on a lie? How do you trust anyone when the person who was supposed to love you unconditionally kicked you out based on a piece of paper? The diner job was mind-numbing, but it paid the bills and kept me busy enough that I didn't have time to think too much about everything I'd lost. My hands, which had been steady and sure when I was working on engines, shook when I carried coffee cups. My back ached from being on my feet all day instead of bent over the hood of a car. Everything about my new life felt wrong, like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit. I started having dreams about the shop, about Dad, about working side by side the way we used to. I'd wake up thinking I could smell motor oil and hear the sound of air tools, only to remember that those days were over forever. The grief felt like drowning, like being pulled under by waves I couldn't see coming. Update 1. It's been 6 months since I wrote that original post, and I honestly didn't think I'd be back here with an update. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and mine just got a lot more complicated. A few weeks ago, I was working the breakfast shift at the diner when this woman came in who looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, and she kept glancing at me like she was trying to work up the courage to say something. Finally, during a lull between the morning rush and lunch prep, she approached the counter. She introduced herself and told me she'd been Mom's best friend growing up, that they'd stayed close until Mom passed. She said she'd been thinking about me lately, wondering how I was doing, and had heard through the Grapper P-Vine about what had happened with Dad and the DNA test. She looked genuinely upset about the whole situation, which was more sympathy than I'd gotten from most people in town. What she told me next made my blood run cold. She said that back when Mom was sick, she'd confided something that had been weighing on her mind. Apparently, my uncle had always been jealous of Dad's success with the shop, jealous of Dad's marriage to Mom, jealous of the family life that Dad had built. Mom had noticed how my uncle would make comments about me not looking like Dad, and she'd been worried about where those comments were leading. But here's the thing that really got to me. Mom had mentioned that my uncle had been asking questions about paternity tests, about how they worked, about whether they could be faked or manipulated. This was years before I was kicked out, back when I was still in high school and everything seemed normal. Mom had thought it was just idle curiosity, but looking back, this woman wondered if there had been more to it. She didn't have any proof of anything, just this nagging feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation. But she gave me the name of a lawyer she knew, someone who handled family disputes and estate issues, and suggested I might want to get a second opinion on those DNA results. I'd been so devastated by everything that had happened that I hadn't really questioned the test results themselves. I mean, why would I? They looked official, they had laboratory letterhead, they had all the technical language you'd expect. But this conversation made me start wondering about things I probably should have wondered about from the beginning. Like why my uncle had been the one to suggest the test in the first place. Like why Dad had agreed to do it secretly instead of just talking to me about his concerns. Like why the results had come back so quickly when everything I'd read online suggested that legitimate DNA tests usually took weeks to process. I took a day off from the diner and drove to the address listed on the laboratory paperwork. It was in a strip mall about an hour away, between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The building looked legitimate enough from the outside, but when I walked in, something felt off immediately. The waiting room was empty except for a receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. When I asked about the DNA test that had been processed for my dad, she gave me a blank stare and told me they'd have to look into it. After about 20 minutes of waiting, a man in a lab coat came out and told me that they had no record of any tests being performed for someone with Dad's name. No record at all. Not in their computer system, not in their paper files, nowhere. He suggested that maybe I was thinking of a different laboratory, or that maybe there had been some kind of clerical error, but he seemed genuinely confused about why I was there looking for test results that didn't exist in their system. I drove home in a daze trying to process what this meant. If the laboratory had no record of the test, then where had those results come from? How had my uncle gotten official-looking paperwork from a company that claimed they'd never done the work? That night, I called the lawyer that Mom's friend had recommended. She listened to my story with the kind of professional calm that made me feel like maybe I wasn't going crazy after all. She explained that DNA test fraud was more common than people realized, especially in cases involving inheritance or family disputes. She said that with the right equipment and software, it wasn't that difficult to create fake laboratory results that looked convincing to someone who didn't know what to look for. She also told me something that hit me like a punch to the gut. Dad had been having health problems lately, nothing life-threatening, but enough that he'd been talking to people about updating his will and making sure his affairs were in order. My uncle had been helping him with a lot of that paperwork, had been the one driving him to appointments when I wasn't around to do it anymore. The timing of everything suddenly made horrible sense. My uncle plants seeds of doubt about my paternity, convinces Dad to get a DNA test, presents fake results that confirm his suspicions, and then steps in to help Dad process the emotional fallout while also positioning himself to inherit the business that should have been mine. I felt sick thinking about how perfectly orchestrated the whole thing had been. How my uncle had played on Dad's insecurities and grief over Mom's death. How he'd used my physical differences from Dad as evidence of infidelity. How he'd manipulated both of us into destroying our relationship so he could benefit from the aftermath. The lawyer suggested that I get a legitimate DNA test done, something that could either confirm or disprove the results that my uncle had presented. She warned me that even if the test proved I was Dad's biological daughter, there was no guarantee that Dad would believe it or that our relationship could be repaired. But she said I deserved to know the truth regardless of what I decided to do with that information. I spent a week thinking about it, weighing the potential consequences of opening this can of worms. Part of me was terrified that the original test results were legitimate, that getting a second test would just confirm that everything I believed about my parentage was a lie. But the bigger part of me couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. I went to a different laboratory, one that came highly recommended and had been in business for decades. I brought photos of Dad and me, explained the situation, and asked them to be absolutely certain about their results. The technician who took my sample was professional and kind, and she assured me that their testing procedures were thorough and accurate. The waiting period for the results was torture. Every day felt like a year, and I found myself checking my phone constantly even though I knew it was too early to hear back. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep properly, couldn't think about anything except what those results were going to say. When the call finally came, I was in the middle of serving lunch to a table of construction workers who came in every Tuesday. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone steady enough to hear what the lab technician was telling me. 99.9% probability of paternity. I was definitely, unequivocally, biologically Dad's daughter. The test my uncle had shown Dad was completely fabricated, a lie designed to destroy our family for his own gain. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. Relief and anger and grief all mixed together into this overwhelming emotion that I didn't have words for. I was Dad's daughter, I'd always been Dad's daughter, and my uncle had stolen months of our relationship based on a lie. But even knowing the truth didn't make figuring out what to do next any easier. How do you approach someone who kicked you out of their life and tell them they were wrong? How do you explain that their own brother manipulated them into abandoning their child? How do you even begin to rebuild trust that's been shattered so completely? Update 2. I wish I could tell you that this story has a happy ending, but life doesn't always work out the way you hope it will. It's been another 4 months since my last update, and everything has changed in ways I never could have predicted. I spent weeks trying to figure out how to approach Dad with the real DNA results. I practiced what I was going to say, how I was going to explain what my uncle had done, how I was going to prove that the original test was fake. I imagined different scenarios. Maybe he'd be angry at first but then relieved to know the truth. Maybe he'd be devastated about what my uncle had done. Maybe he'd just be happy to have me back in his life. I finally worked up the courage to go to the shop on a Thursday afternoon when I knew it would be slow. I had the real DNA test results in my purse, along with documentation from the fake laboratories showing that they had no record of ever testing our samples. I had rehearsed my speech a dozen times and I felt as ready as I was ever going to be. But when I got there, the shop was closed. Not just closed for the day, really closed, with a sign in the window and everything covered in dust sheets. My heart started racing as I walked around to the back entrance, thinking maybe Dad was inside doing inventory or paperwork, but the building was empty. I drove to the house and that's when I saw my uncle's truck in the driveway. My stomach dropped as I realized that something was very wrong. I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to decide whether to knock on the door or drive away, when my uncle came outside and spotted me. He walked over to my car with this expression on his face that I'd never seen before, not the fake sympathy he'd been showing me for months, but something that looked almost like satisfaction. He told me that Dad had gotten sick the week before, that he'd been in the hospital for a few days with heart problems and that he'd passed away 2 days ago. The funeral had been small, just close family and a few friends from the shop. My uncle said he'd thought about calling me, but Dad had been very clear in his final days that he didn't want me there. He said Dad had died believing that I wasn't his daughter, that Mom had betrayed him, that everything about his family life had been a lie. I couldn't breathe. I sat there in my car, staring at my uncle through the windshield, holding the DNA test results that would have changed everything if I'd been brave enough to bring them to Dad sooner. The truth that could have saved our relationship, could have exposed my uncle's lies, could have given us a chance to heal the damage that had been done. It was all worthless now. My uncle kept talking, but I couldn't really hear what he was saying. Something about how Dad had left the shop to him, how he was going to keep the family business running, how he hoped there wouldn't be any hard feelings about the way things had worked out. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted and completely disconnected from the reality of what was happening. I drove away without saying a word to him. I went back to my friend's apartment and locked myself in the spare room and didn't come out for 3 days. The grief was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the normal grief of losing a parent, but the specific agony of knowing that he died believing lies about me, about Mom, about our entire family. The DNA test results sat on my dresser for weeks, this piece of paper that proved my innocence but couldn't bring back the person who needed to see it. I thought about confronting my uncle, about exposing what he'd done to the rest of our extended family, about trying to contest Dad's will based on the fraud that had been committed. But what was the point? Dad was gone, and nothing I did was going to bring him back or undo the months of pain we both endured. I did eventually tell a few people the truth. Mom's old friend who had started me down this path, the lawyer who had helped me get the real DNA test, a couple of cousins who had always been kind to me. Most of them were horrified when they learned what my uncle had done, but they were also reluctant to get involved in what they saw as family drama. It's easier to stay neutral when you don't have to live with the consequences. My uncle has been running the shop for the past few months, and from what I hear, he's doing well enough to keep it profitable. He hired a couple of mechanics to replace the work that Dad and I used to do, and he's expanded into selling used cars in addition to doing repairs. The business that had been in our family for 3 generations is thriving under his management, which somehow makes everything hurt even more. I've been thinking a lot about what Dad would want me to do now. Would he want me to fight for the shop that should have been mine? Would he want me to expose my uncle's lies to everyone who would listen? Would he want me to find some way to forgive and move on? I honestly don't know, and I'll never get the chance to ask him. What I do know is that carrying around this anger and grief isn't serving me anymore. It's not bringing Dad back, it's not punishing my uncle the way he deserves to be punished, and it's not helping me build the kind of life that would make Dad proud if he were still here to see it. I've been saving up money from the diner job, and I'm planning to move to a different city where I can start over completely. Maybe I'll find work at another repair shop, maybe I'll do something entirely different. I haven't decided yet. But I need to get away from this place where everywhere I look reminds me of what I've lost and what was stolen from me. The hardest part is accepting that some injustices never get resolved, that some wrongs never get made right, that sometimes the bad guys win and there's nothing you can do about it. My uncle destroyed my relationship with my dad, stole my inheritance, and got away with all of it. Dad died believing that I wasn't his daughter and that Mom had betrayed him. Those are facts that I have to live with regardless of what the DNA test says. But I'm still Dad's daughter even if he never got to know that before he died. I still have all the skills he taught me, all the values he instilled in me, all the love he gave me during the years when our relationship was strong. My uncle can steal a lot of things, but he can't steal those memories or the person those experiences shaped me into. I carry Dad with me in the way I approach problems methodically, the way I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty, the way I believe in doing good work even when no one is watching. Those aren't things that DNA tests can prove or disprove, they're just part of who I am because of who raised me. Maybe someday I'll find a way to honor Dad's memory that doesn't involve fighting my uncle for a business that would probably just remind me of everything I lost. Maybe I'll open my own shop in a different city, or teach other young women the skills that Dad taught me, or find some other way to carry on the legacy that he wanted to pass down to me. For now, I'm just taking it one day at a time, trying to process the grief and the anger and the unfairness of it all. Some days are better than others. Some days I can almost imagine a future where this pain doesn't define everything about my life. And some days I just miss my dad so much that I can barely function. But I keep going because that's what he would have wanted me to do. I keep working, keep saving money, keep planning for a future that looks nothing like what I thought it would be but might still be worth living. And I keep the real DNA test results in my jewelry box, not because I need them to prove anything to anyone, but because they're proof that love and biology and family are more complicated than any test can measure. The truth is that my uncle may have won this battle, but he hasn't won the war. He's got the shop and the money and the satisfaction of knowing he pulled off his scheme. But he's also a person who has to live with himself every day, knowing what he did to his own brother and his brother's daughter. He has to wake up every morning and look at himself in the mirror and know that he's the kind of person who would destroy a family for personal gain. I wouldn't trade places with him for anything in the world because at least I can sleep at night knowing that I'm not that kind of person. At least I know that the love between Dad and me was real, even if it got buried under lies and manipulation. At least I know that I'm exactly who I've always been, his daughter, in every way that matters. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough because it's all I've got left.